During the following 3-month period of waiting and preparing just behind the front line, the men in the battalion were permitted leave to go back home. For many, this would be their last visit. My grandfather, Rickman, went to Godalming in Surrey to marry his fiancée, Muriel Fulton, my grandmother. She would be his second wife. The photo before you is of the two of them. It was taken a few weeks after Rickman had heard that his divorce from his first wife had come through, and about 5 weeks before the first day of the Battle of the Somme. He took with him as a wedding present a silver tray inscribed with the names of the 35 officers of the battalion. This is a coded telegram sent by Rickman from Port Said to his fiancée, indicating that their planned marriage was all on track. "Go to the florists, all well, Rickman," it states. The telegram was sent by Rickman soon after he'd heard the news that he was now legally divorced from his first wife. By the start of the war, Rickman's first marriage, within which 3 children were born, was floundering, both his former wife and he having found new partners, his wife having developed a relationship with one of Rickman's best friends, a Captain John Hubert Matthews, whom, like Rickman, was an officer in the Northumberland Fusiliers. Both Matthews and Rickman had fought together during the Boer War. In those days, grounds for a divorce were very limited and biased in the husband's favour. A husband could divorce his wife if she committed adultery, but if a husband committed adultery, this would not be sufficient grounds for a wife to divorce. The husband would have had to have committed another matrimonial offence into the bargain. One of these offences was desertion of his wife. Though this was clearly a double standard, the reason for it was this: the husband's prime responsibility at the time was to take care of his wife. Therefore, it followed that as long as that was the case, the husband's fidelity was of no consequence. So extramarital affairs, normally but not always conducted by the husband in the marriage, were commonplace and nobody would bat an eyelid. But a wife, on the other hand, if caught doing the same thing, was viewed as being disrespectful of the care that her husband had bestowed upon her. The latter conduct in Edwardian society would be viewed as a social taboo, and the wife would almost certainly become a pariah in society. So Rickman, in order to protect his wife's reputation, agreed for the sake of her long-term happiness that he would be the respondent in the divorce and his wife the plaintiff. To do this, he set up a charade whereby some witnesses would observe him walking into the Charing Cross Hotel in London with another woman whom was not his second wife but merely a proxy. Once this ruse had been accomplished, he would then admit in court documents that he no longer wished to live with his wife, and that as her conjugal rights were being denied to her, she should be granted a divorce on the grounds of desertion. Divorce in those days was extremely rare and expensive. Only 1 in 450 marriages ended in divorce, but also, prior to the war, it was a scandal. As a corollary to that, and from a military point of view, a divorced officer would likely encourage a lack of respect among the lower ranks, which would lead to insubordination. Frank Richards, who in the First World War served in the ranks and then became an accomplished author in regard to that war and close friend of Robert Graves, observed, while commenting on regimental divorce, that a murder would be far more likely. But by the time the divorce had been granted, Rickman was already the 11th Battalion commander, and officers with combat experience were in very short supply. Thus, Rickman was regarded as indispensable. Also, the old Victorian and Edwardian moral codes of conduct were being challenged by the onslaught of the war, and strict rectitude in regard to what was deemed right and wrong was becoming blurred. If the divorce had preceded the war, Rickman would, as an adulterer, most likely have had to resign his commission from the army. And given that by 1914 he was 39 years old, it is dubious as to whether he would have played any military role in the war whatsoever. 2 months ago, while online, I searched for the divorce documents. When I found them, I discovered that they had only just been unsealed 102 years after the divorce was granted. The reason behind this is not entirely clear, as my mother and other descendants were, one way or another, aware of this episode in my grandfather's life. It's sad to say that Captain John Hubert Matthews was killed on September the 15th, 1914, when he was hit in the head by a piece of shrapnel whilst on duty in a trench just north of the town of Vailly in northern France. Rickman's first wife never remarried. During the early summer of 1916, rehearsals for the battalion and brigade attack on Serre began immediately. A stretch of land supposedly similar to the brigade attack was laid out for the rehearsal. Shallow ditches represented British and German trenches, flags at the limits of the artillery barrage, and tapes the starting and finishing points of each wave. The 11th East Lancs attacked to the east in 3 bounds of 4 waves under a mock moving barrage which lifted from the enemy front trench at 0 hour. It then moved forward at the walking pace of the waves of infantry. General Hunter Weston's confidence that there would not be a rat alive in the German trenches reached down to most of his officers, but a few of his men remained sceptical. Private Pollard was one. We captured Serre 3 times a day. It was a joke. All the mistakes of the day were gone over. Each of the 4 waves was meant to advance at intervals in daylight towards the German trenches, occupy them, consolidate, then allowing the succeeding waves to pass through. It didn't seem practical to me, I said to Lieutenant Ashworth. This advance, sir, it's not going to be like that. We might be going the other road, retreating before we are finished. He said, Pollard, don't you know the British Army never retreats? I said, what happened at Mons then? That, he said, was a strategic manoeuvre. Lieutenant Ashworth and the other officers made it look simple, and we were not allowed to think of anything, only success. We were treated like imbeciles. It was during this time that a letter was written to a local newspaper by Corporal Bradshaw describing life in the trenches. Bradshaw concluded, "We have not had anything from the Comforts Fund yet, except cap badges for which we are charged 2 and 6 each. I suppose we will get something in a day or 2. There are rumours that lots of things are on the way." Public criticism about the fund forced a reply from Harwood, the mayor of Accrington. To the PALs have gone 200 cap badges, canvas covers for machine guns and rifles, 16 pieces of band music, 500 tins of cocoa, 800 pairs of socks, 144 safety razors, and 8 footballs at a cost of £160. We have not sent any cakes, sweets or cigarettes, but have asked the CO to specify any requirements. Rickman's requirements from the fund were clearly different from those of his Accrington men. He explained in his reply to Harwood, "The 200 cap badges have been distributed, and in other circumstances the men would have to pay for them. Cigarettes can be bought cheaper here than in England." More concerned about operational needs than sweets or cakes, Rickman appealed to Harwood to send, as soon as possible, several pairs of wire cutters. This correspondence says much for the value that Rickman placed on his relationship with Harwood and the closeness with which the hometowns kept in touch with the battalion. Rickman, as previously mentioned, pursued this correspondence whilst on the eve of the biggest offensive of the war. As dawn broke at 4 a.m. on 1st July 1916, German artillery fire intensified. The men of the 11th Battalion hugged the floor of their trenches as the shell fire steadily stripped away their cover. Unknown to them, they were about to face the biggest barrage of artillery and machine gun fire that any British army had witnessed to date. And Lieutenant Colonel Rickman was the only man in the battalion whom had had experience of military combat. At 7:15 a.m. that morning, the grueling wait was about to come to an end, and the first wave would, in a matter of minutes, be mounting the trenches and going over. Lieutenant Colonel Rickman was commanding operations from CSAP. A SAP was a trench which was designed to be at 90 degrees to the front line trenches and which stretched out into no man's land. This is what he would have looked out onto. The following extracts that I'm about to read come from an account by Rickman. It is entitled Report on Operations June 30th to July 1st, 1916. What comes across in these extracts all too well is the total loss of communications. In short, it is a vivid description of the fog of war. Rickman writes, 7:20 a.m. The Hurricane bombardment opened and first wave crossed into no man's land. The Germans opened immediately with machine gun and rifle fire, putting on a few minutes later an intense barrage. 7:22 a.m. The second wave proceeded to follow the first wave into no man's land. 7:29 a.m. I saw my third and fourth waves advancing from Campion and Monk trenches respectively. They crossed into no man's land, crossing the front line about 7:32 a.m. 7:39 a.m. Heavy machine gun and rifle fire still coming from German first line. Intense fire of all description. 7:42 a.m. I reported by runner, intense fire of all description. 7:50 a.m. I sent Lieutenant McAlpine to establish telephone communication between Mark Copse and my HQ. Lieutenant McAlpine returned and informed me that all communication was cut and it was not re-established all day. 8:10 a.m. I further reported I could see odd groups in my front believed to be wounded. Also that I could not see any of my waves. Heavy artillery barrage on front line. 8:22 a.m. Heavy machine gun fire still coming from my left over Mark Copse, and now and then a burst from right. No information from my waves. 9 a.m. Report from Corporal Rigby, wounded, belonging to first wave, states that 7 of his platoon got into first line. They held it for about 20 minutes and bombing back Germans until bombs were exhausted. Corporal Rigby saw remains of second wave in front of German barbed wire. Germans still holding out. Saw no sign of third wave or fourth wave. 10:05 a.m. No report from my waves. 10 wounded men 11th East Lancs have returned, and they state front line still in German hands. 11:25 a.m. A number of wounded in SAP-C and in Exma. Field dressings urgently required. Captain Livesey, first wave, with remnants of second wave, together with third wave, charged German trenches led by Captain Livesey. Lieutenant Thompson also entered German trenches. Captain Livesey sent back a message for reinforcement. This never reached me. 11:50 a.m. Captain Pelser and Lieutenant Ryden wounded. Lieutenant Ryden remained on duty. I asked for reinforcement of 1 company, as only a few of Captain Curran's party arrived. Was promised company by HQ. They never arrived. 12 noon. I proceeded to put front line in state of defence as far as possible against counter-attack. SAP-C, which had been opened up, was blocked by bomb stops. I asked Staff Captain for supply of bombs, which later arrived. 3:10 p.m. The trench mortars occupying Sab C were withdrawn and put in emplacements on right and left of Sab C. I went by my whole front line and reported there were very few bays defensible. 93 Brigade have withdrawn their men, and I have only left 1 officer and 25 other ranks of my own regiment available. 2 Stokes guns in position. I'm holding by means of bomb stops. 3:50 p.m. Very intense bombardment of my front line. Urgently require more men. I have 55 men in all, some of whom are wounded. 2 Lewis guns. Only 2 men to work them, 1 of them wounded. Magazines filled by officers' servants. Lieutenant Ryden severely wounded. 9:20 p.m. As regards numbers, I have at present 56, maybe 50 men, including Stokes mortars. There are no Lewis or machine guns in line. I am getting the wounded evacuated as soon as possible, but there are a good number yet to be attended to. I have 5 red rockets at Sab C, but I have no rockets at Whalley or any very lights or pistols. The men are a good deal rattled. And have very few NCOs. Just completed inspection. SOS rockets in position. 9:40 p.m. Here, I was knocked out by shell. The book, entitled The History of the East Lancashire Regiment in the Great War, records that out of some 720 Accrington pals who took part in the attack, 584 were killed, wounded or missing. All but 1 of the medical staff and stretcher bearers were casualties. More were to die directly and indirectly of their wounds in future months and years. The Accrington pals were effectively decimated in a matter of minutes on the first day on the Somme. Lieutenant General Hunter Weston's assurances that there would not be a rat alive in the German trenches now had a false and bitter ring to it. Private Marshall was the very last survivor of the Accrington pals. I mentioned him earlier, the private who had noticed a pal with his belt on the wrong way around on the day the battalion had met Lieutenant Colonel Rickman. Marshall recalled, many years later, many were killed and wounded even before they could get out of the trenches. In less than 20 minutes, 235 pals were dead. Not 1 man wavered or turned back. The news was slow in reaching Accrington. At first, the local papers had put a spin on the battle, claiming that, apart from some wounded, the assault on Serre had been a success. But on 8th July, a week after the assault, a troop train carrying wounded soldiers back from the Somme came to a halt on the elevated track at the north end of Horn Street in Accrington. Windows were opened and soldiers called down to women in the street, asking where they were. On hearing the reply, Accrington, the soldiers cried out, "Accrington? The Accrington pals have been wiped out." Rumours now abounded about the pals, and the news began to spread fast around the town. On July the 20th, Rickman wrote to the Mayor of Accrington from his hospital bed, listing officer casualties. 7 killed, 12 wounded, 1 missing. Roughly 60% of the officers were casualties. The 11th Battalion's earlier enthusiasm in the days of enlistment had been evaporated. It had been blown away at Serre on the Somme. The events of July the 1st had radically changed the survivors' outlook, but in spite of their misgivings, the survivors of the old battalion passed something of their pals' spirit of comradeship to the new recruits. although the loss of so many local officers, NCOs and men had resulted in a weakening of the old East Lancashire associations. Private Sayer, upon his return from hospital to the job of training 32 volunteer bandsmen as stretcher bearers, had the following to say about his new duties. Major Kershaw, then on brigade staff, told me he wanted to train the replacement stretcher bearers. I can't do it, sir. I'm a bomber. Nonsense. I know you were a doctor's pupil before you enlisted. You used to treat my wife's mother in Burnley. If you can do that, you can teach first aid. From then on, I taught first aid on actual casualties, often under fire from snipers. It was tougher than being a bomber. In February 1917, 6 officers and 200 other ranks joined the battalion, now making a total of 700 replacements. In order to flesh out depleted battalions with experienced men, recovered wounded from other regiments were attached to the 11th Battalion. Also, it was now War Office policy to break up the community-based New Army battalions whose losses had so affected public morale. This was a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that while the PALS battalions had been a very clever recruitment strategy, it had in fact reaped a terrible whirlwind in its effects on local communities. Thus, the battalion was brought up to full strength by relinquishing its local associations. That same month, the Germans made a tactical withdrawal of approximately 18,000 yards from their front lines on the Somme to prepared positions known as the Hindenburg Line. British forces, including the 11th Battalion East Lancashires, moved up to fill the gap. The battalion ended up 2 miles south of Serre, which the Germans had evacuated on February the 24th. 2 weeks later, in mid-March, whilst in reserve at Courcelles and working near Serre on road repairs, it fell to some of the 11th East Lancs to discover the bodies of several of their comrades reported missing since July 1st, 1916. The ravages of rats, weather and time having taken their toll. During the early months of 1917, the battalion had a relatively non-eventful time, for the most part holding and patrolling a relatively inactive sector of the front. With Rickman, who had been invalided home due to injuries he had suffered on July 1st, 1916, now back in command, the battalion attacked successfully, though at a cost of 12 dead, the German positions in Cadorna Trench at Oppy Wood near Arras. But the remainder of 1917 was to be much quieter, although German shellfire caused casualties. The first major trial of the battalion in 1918 started on the morning of March 21st. An artillery barrage of almost 6,000 guns and 62 German infantry divisions attacked along a line from the Somme to Cambrai. The 11th Battalion rushed to meet the enemy at Hamilcourt near Arras. For 8 long days until relieved, the 11th Battalion, as part of 31 Division, resisted the forces of 5 German divisions. Between March the 27th and April the 4th, the 11th East Lancs lost 240 men killed, wounded or missing. In the same period, no less than 28 awards were won by the battalion. One of these was a VC awarded posthumously to Basil Horsfall, the citation of which was published in the London Gazette on 21st of May 1918. The following extracts are taken from a letter written to Horsfall's parents by Rickman shortly after their son's death. I received a message from him saying that he'd been driven back, but that he was counter-attacking, which he most successfully did, driving the enemy back
and gaining his objective, he being wounded severely at the time. He held his ground, though his company had lost 135 out of 180 engaged. During the retirement, he was unfortunately killed close to the ridge, which he had so gallantly held for 2 days. There is little that I can say that befits the glorious record of your son's death. His name will forever be remembered by his regiment and by all who had the honour to know him. I have lost a personal friend and an officer whose deeds will forever go down to posterity.
Many years later, Arthur Cheetham described Basil Horsfall's final moments to the PAL's local newspaper, the Accrington Observer. The order to retire came. Before we set off, Second Lieutenant Horsfall shouted, "Every man for himself." Terrible words, but a terrible situation to be in. Second Lieutenant Horsfall was on my left as we started to cross an old airfield, but 20 yards after we started, he simply wasn't there. Our company lost about 25 men crossing that airfield. There were 5 of us in my party, and 2 didn't make it. Of all the time I spent in France, that was a day I will never forget. On April 11th, the Germans broke through the line held by the Portuguese troops on the River Lys. The 11th Battalion raced to fill the gap and were drawn into bitter and ruthless fighting. Again, the battalion suffered heavy losses. Rickman, whom had been awarded the DSO for his actions on the first day of the Battle of Serre, was also awarded a bar to his DSO for his actions at the River Lys. Part of the citation reads as follows. This officer commanded his battalion, covering the retirement of the brigade to a new position after both flanks had been turned. He displayed great courage and judgment. The following day, he held an extended front against 3 determined attacks, and when the troops on his right flank were driven in, he rallied them under close fire and formed a defensive flank with them. Just over 2 months later, the battalion took part in a successful counterattack on a German salient in the Dnieper forest and gained 2,000 yards of ground. By a coincidence, the 3 major attacks of the battalion were at almost yearly intervals. On July the 1st, the battalion handed over the captured ground to relieving forces. The battalion's final main action to clear Plogstedt Wood started on September the 28th. They achieved it at a high price of 370 killed, wounded and missing. Private Fred Leeming was the last to die that day. He was also the very last of the original PALs to be killed in action during the war. During the weeks leading up to the armistice, the battalion was busy chasing the retreating Germans. On the evening of 10th November, the battalion halted east of Rennes, in what was now British-occupied Belgium, and settled for the night in barns, outhouses and stables. At 9 a.m. the following morning, as the battalion assembled to continue their march, Rickman, whom was now back in command of the battalion, having taken temporary command of 92 Infantry Brigade after the Battle of the River Lys, went through the formality of reading the battalion the dispatch which had arrived by motorbike the night before. Armistice signed 3 a.m. this morning, all firing to cease at 11 a.m. When that time arrived, the battalion halted, and every man listened. For the first time in their Western Front service, no sound could be heard. The war was now finally over. At dusk that same day, the battalion entered Grammont, 20 miles east of Brussels. Here, at Grammont, Private Andrew McGrath, a bandsman, stretcher-bearer, and survivor of July the 1st, 1916, caught a chill while out celebrating peace and died a few days later of pneumonia. He was the last of the original PALs to die on active service. It was from here that the battalion resumed its return march via Menin and Ypres to Saint-Omer in northern France. In spite of an appeal by Rickman to the War Office to allow him to bring the battalion back to Accrington for a farewell parade before demobilization, the breakup of the battalion started in December as men in certain occupations, particularly coal mining, were released. On February the 7th, 1919, at Saint-Omer, the regimental colours were presented to a fast and dwindling battalion by Brigadier General T.L. Williams. 4 weeks later, just 4 years and 1 week after his memorable takeover at Carnarvon, Rickman relinquished his command. By this time, at least 850 men of this battalion had died in the service of their country. 217 weeks after the first recruits to the Accrington PALs had joined up on 14th September 1914, the battalion had suffered an estimated 2,920 casualties. Rickman's farewell order, of which every officer and man in the battalion received his personal copy, stated the following: "On relinquishing the command of my battalion, I wish to express my deep appreciation to the officers, warrant officers, NCOs, and men of the battalion for their great loyalty and splendid example of devotion to duty throughout the whole period of my command. The higher command have been good enough to express their appreciation of the fine work done by the battalion, and without the splendid cooperation of all ranks, it would have been impossible to have accomplished all that the battalion has been given to do. It is with the greatest regret that I leave the battalion, which I had hoped to bring home to its birthplace, and I wish to thank all ranks for their unswerving loyalty and for their high esprit de corps and comradeship, which has maintained in the battalion the highest traditions of the British Army. I wish all ranks Godspeed, and I hope to renew in the near future the friendships that I have made and which I hope I shall never lose. Signed, Lieutenant Colonel Rickman, March the 6th, 1919. For the original PALs, the return to East Lancashire saw no cheering crowds and no mayoral speeches. For those of the PALs who were left, war weariness had long replaced the high spirits of Rugeley, Ripon and Salisbury Plain, and the impatience of getting to the front. The 1920s and 1930s passed, with most of East Lancashire preoccupied in surviving the interwar industrial depression. The survivors of the war and the widows and children of the dead endured the indignities of the means test and the semi-starvation of unemployment. Some of the survivors emigrated, but the shadow of war remained. Private Varley died, aged 36, in 1924, directly of pneumonia, indirectly from gassing. His widow was denied a war pension because the medical authorities diagnosed his death as due to natural causes. Sergeant Rigby, MM, wounded on July 1, 1916, wounded in April, in August, and again in September 1918, died aged 41 in 1928 of tuberculosis, contracted as a result of war service. John Harwood's name did not appear in the 1919 honours list. During the war, no man had worked harder in his patriotic duty. The good regard for him in his hometown had been coloured by his zeal and lack of objectiveness after he had been appointed by the War Office as their military representative on the Accrington Military Tribunal. Shopkeepers and the self-employed had often been exempted from military service, but this had rarely happened to employed persons regardless of circumstance. A local MP, Philip Snowden, criticised Harwood in a debate in the House of Commons as a prominent Conservative, instrumental in deciding whether political opponents should or should not be granted exemption. This factor was probably Harwood's downfall. In 1919, he retired from public life, worn out. When Colonel Sharples died aged 79 in 1929, the final link with the memorable and often semi-comic days of the autumn and winter of 1914 was finally broken. Each man had fond memories of the Colonel, especially in regard to his amiable discipline, his sending home with mild reproof those who had paraded with a pint or two inside them, his taking a parade in full military uniform except for a workman's cap to keep the wind out, the occasional late parade because of pressing business in his solicitor's office, and his admonishment to a private aged 40 who swore at a second lieutenant aged 18, "Don't use that naughty word to a lad again." Colonel Sharples' paternalistic eccentricity and his men's good-natured, respectful response helped, no doubt, to form the good character of the battalion. Undoubtedly, Colonel Sharples' early leadership had been crucial to both its active service performance and reputation. July the 1st became a date for the town, which was filled with both poignancy and bitterness. The High Command's errors of judgment and organisation of July the 1st, 1916, was seen by many pals as deliberate decisions made by men indifferent to their fate. Not a rat alive was now a sardonic joke. July the 1st became not a time for simple remembrance, but a focal point for an emotive imagery of the wholesale massacre of pals. But together with the romantic view of little Accrington having raised its own battalion in competition with the major cities of industrial Britain, the Accrington Pals came to be seen as the epitome of Kitchener's New Army battalions of 1914. In the minds of many, the Accrington Pals represent those who, in the innocence of youthful ideas of patriotism and service, started early in the fight. They represent those whose abstract ideals were destroyed with their youth in the terrifying realities of the slaughterhouse of the Somme. In a book written by Peter Hodgkinson entitled The British Infantry Battalion Commanders in the First World War, Hodgkinson writes the following about Rickman. The traditional notion of the dugout officer of the Great War is of a blimpish individual, unfit and underskilled, blundering into the white heat of a new warfare with attitudes redolent of the Crimea. True perhaps for a minority, the reality of many officers was entirely different. Lieutenant Colonel Rickman's death was a wasteful end to the life of a man who had sustained 3 years of command and survived wounding twice and being gassed twice on the Western Front. Had he lived, he would no doubt have been amused that the volume of the official history which dealt with the events of 1st July 1916, published in 1932, recorded that he was killed that day. Rickman is the epitome of the adaptable, enduring, reliable battalion commander of the new armies, and shows some of the depth and ability of professional soldiers that the army could call on. The vicar of Coombe Bissett, Wiltshire, whom officiated at his funeral, wrote, "Few would have suspected from his simple and unassuming manner the distinguished nature of his military service." My grandfather's wasteful end, as Hodgkinson described it, occurred in 1925. He died in an accident at his home in Wiltshire. While stepping out of his car, which was parked in the garage, he accidentally got part of his coat caught up in the flywheel of the petrol engine that was used to light his home. As a result, part of his body got pulled in. The gardener, on hearing his shouts, came to the rescue, but it was too late. Moments later, he was laid out on the lawn beside his house to be given a moment or two to say his final goodbyes to his second wife and their 3 children. My mother was aged 4 at the time, and saying her final goodbye to her father was probably her most vivid and perhaps as well her only abiding memory of him. Throughout her life, she must have wondered how or why this accident occurred. She probably had put it down to sheer carelessness or lack of mindfulness. Recently, I came across a document written by a Northern Command military medical board for the purpose of examining and reporting on an injury sustained by Lieutenant Colonel Rickman on July the 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. As mentioned, Rickman, drawing up his report on operations for that day from his hospital bed, states that at 9:20 p.m. he was knocked out by shell. The Military Medical Board document states the following: he was knocked out by shell which burst near him. He was unconscious for 2.5 hours. He was bruised all over his body. There was a rupture of left tympanic membrane. He is now deaf in the left ear. He is suffering from nervous exhaustion, weakness of legs. His memory is bad and sleeps bad. Requires rest. Could it be that my grandfather's deafness in his left ear was a cause or contributory factor to his death, and that therefore his actions on that fateful day were not quite so wasteful or reckless as would appear? The spatial hearing loss would have meant that deciphering background sounds, in this case the noise of the generator, and where those sounds originated from, would not have been quite so straightforward as for a person with unimpaired hearing. That is to say, he would have been suffering from what is now termed a spatial deficit. I'll never know the answer to that question, but just like thousands of others who were to die years later of wounds inflicted during the war, it could be that his deafness was an indirect cause of his death 9 years later. I was born 31 years later. In my youth, I would occasionally look over at my grandfather's medals, arrayed in a box case on a shelf in my bedroom. I was, at the time, the custodian of these medals, but if I'm truthful, they didn't mean much to me. My grandfather had always been a remote figure in my mind. I couldn't really connect to him. This was probably due to the fact that he was hardly ever talked about in family conversation. I guess because he was nearly as remote to my mother as he was to me, and what little memory that she had had of him had been filled with sadness. Sadness and silence often make the best of bedfellows, but at least now I've finally met up, in an oblique way, with my grandfather. The past is indeed a foreign country.